Josh Hammer is here, host of The Josh Hammer Show and the senior editor-at-large for Newsweek. Josh, how you doing?
Mike, I'm doing all right. Always a pleasure to join you.
I'm glad you're here. So let's talk about Trump's legal issues. I think we've become numb to it, perhaps. At least I have. It's just like, oh, okay, whatever. We're at 91 charges. He'll spend 10,000 years in jail, whatever. But these are real, or not, or is it all for show? How do you interpret this?
So since the beginning, going back to the first indictment, the Alvin Bragg indictment in New York City, I mean, my approach personally has always been that you have to take each indictment on its own individual merit. So the indictment in New York City with Alvin Bragg is laughably frivolous. I mean, that was the first out of the gate. It's totally absurd. I mean, it's absolutely outrageous to try to indict him for essentially just making a payment. I mean, it's a totally contorted statutory interpretation they're doing there. It's transparently a political persecution. Alvin Bragg, of course, a Soros-funded prosecutor who literally ran for office on a platform that he would prosecute Trump the same way that Tish James, the Attorney General of New York State, ran that platform. So that was just totally laughable. I mean, the next three indictments are of varying degrees of slightly more serious. Now, here in Florida, where I live, I mean, that federal prosecution brought by special counsel Jack Smith that will be heard before Judge Cannon, I think that the facts there are potentially the most troubling as far as just kind of legal implications, because the factual allegations include, again, it's just an allegation, but they say that Trump just flat up ignored a grand jury subpoena. I mean, that's very bad if true. Again, it's just an allegation there. And now the silver lining there is that this is in Florida. It's a more, it's a redder jurisdiction. It's not even in kind of like urban Florida. It's a little more rural, so he might get a decent jury pool there. The one in Washington, D.C., is potentially troublesome because it's Washington, D.C. It's also a deeply, deeply chilling interpretation of free speech. It's really kind of infringing upon free speech. The one that I would be most concerned about if I were Trump by far, and I don't even think it's a close call, is Georgia, especially in the aftermath of some of his, former lawyers, folks like Sidney Powell and Jenna Ellis taking plea deals. They seem like they are potentially kind of going to end up testifying against Trump in court. I think you could see, Governor Kemp, Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger actually taking the stand against Trump there. And again, that's the Republican establishment in Georgia. It's going to be a hostile jurisdiction in Fulton County, Georgia. To me, that is the most troubling right there in Georgia, I think.
Is he worried about it from a legal perspective?
It's hard to say, right? I mean, Trump is Trump. I mean, what you see is what you get. I mean, it's kind of hard to kind of figure out how he subjectively is feeling deep down there. I mean, he kind of unleashes these paroxysms of rage, if you will, on his Truth Social feed, where he's kind of emoting with kind of the all caps, like the 10 exclamation marks at the end. But that's really nothing that we haven't seen from Trump for many years now, going back to when he was posting on Twitter when he was president. So, I mean, his behavior, from what I can see as kind of a public observer, hasn't tended to change a lot. I'm not sure what kind of counsel he's getting from his inner circle of legal advisors at this point, but I think that the Georgia one is very troubling. Again, this is also a state prosecution. I mean, there's no federal pardon for a state crime. So this, to me, is the most troubling on multiple levels.
Yeah, it's in a weird place because I think I'm like numbing myself to it by saying, oh, come on, like we know how ridiculous it all is, but they would never put him in jail. I mean, come on, like, it's a former president, he's running as the front runner. Like, they would never put the front runner in jail, but they would, right? I mean, where are you on that?
So one thing to bear in mind here when it comes to all of the Trump lawfare is the timing. Trials take a long time, especially in Georgia. There are a lot of people that the DA there has charged. Now, many of them have taken plea deals, folks like the ones I mentioned, Sidney Powell, Jenna Ellis, and some others. But there are many who have not taken a plea deal yet, and it seems like the prosecutors, they are going to see this through. It's going to take a long time. So I guess what I'm saying, Mike, is I just kind of looking at the calendar ahead, I don't think any of this is going to wrap up for sure before the end of the primary season. I guess there's a chance that someone could actually render a verdict and charges could drop before the general election next November. Maybe they would want to do that if just to kind of pull a political heist, right? And nothing, as you just mentioned, nothing really is too low for the modern Democratic Party and the modern left these days. But based on my knowledge of how trials work, again, as kind of a federal court of appeals law clerk, Objectively speaking, I would be surprised if any of these trials actually wrap up and charges actually drop before next November 2024. Again, then the only question is whether they will kind of try to superficially expedite this just to try to get independent voters to vote for someone other than Donald Trump at the general election ballot box next November, which is totally not beneath them, but it would be a highly unusual and expedited legal process, to put it mildly.
Well, there's plenty of unusual things that have happened so far with this. What do you think is motivating the people who are doing this against him legally?
I think it's pretty straightforward, right? I mean, the people in charge of the FBI and kind of the highest levels of power when it comes to the various prosecutorial apparatuses in this country at the federal, state, local level, they have clearly been out to get Trump, going back to the 2016 campaign. This goes back as far as Carter Page and the FISA warrants, Kevin Kleinsmith forging on the FISA warrants. Kevin Kleinsmith, by the way, the only person that the Durham probe ended up kind of finding was guilty. I mean, that whole thing was a sham. I mean, going back then to James Comey, I mean, you go on and on and on here. The Russia collusion, delusion, the two impeachments. I mean, they clearly have been trying to get this guy since day one. And to be clear, that is not to say that Trump is a pristine or perfect figure. He obviously makes any number of missteps. If you take that Florida indictment on its face, and again, I'm not saying you should necessarily do that. That's just the prosecutor's view of it. But the factual allegations that are made by Jack Smith and his team of U.S. attorneys on that federal indictment, the fact pattern's pretty bad. Again, like, you can't just ignore a grand jury subpoena. That's just common sense 101, or at least I was taught it was common sense 101 back when I was in law school. So I'm not saying that he is a perfect figure here, but his basic MO that they've been out to get him since he walked down the gilded escalator in the summer of 2015, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, I think it's true for everyone too. I'm haunted by the story of the guy, I forget what his name was on Twitter, but he had 58,000 Twitter followers. And he tweeted out this meme that said, avoid the line, vote from home, text Hillary to 95955. And he did that in 2016. 5,000 people, 4,900 people texted it, but who knows if that was like people just curious or like what. He got 7 months in jail for breaking, denying people the right to vote, and democracy was torn asunder, and an assault on democracy. It's like, geez. But the thing that really stands out to me, other than the absurdity of it, is that happened in 2016, and he wasn't charged with anything until Joe Biden took office. So it's 4 years later, and then it was another 2-3 years until the trial was over. So 7 years of all this. So they can go back a long time and get you on something if they want to, right?
Yeah, totally. So that guy's name, if I recall, is Douglas Mackey. I mean, I don't have a ton of personal sympathy for him because he was kind of an alt-right, frankly, kind of an anti-Semitic guy when he was tweeting back in 2016 under his Ricky Vaughn pseudonym. But as an objective legal matter, this is obviously absurd. And it's truly chilling and terrible for free speech. And I'll kind of give you another reason why it's so chilling to me, which is at the same time that Mackey was tweeting these things, and this is kind of the lead up to the 2016 election. It was October, early November 2016. There was a Hillary Clinton blue check Twitter follower. I'm blanking on her name, but she did the exact same thing. She literally did the exact same thing. She was like, oh, Trump voters, you can skip the line. Why don't you just text this number? It's factually indistinguishable. They're the exact same thing. And Mike, you guessed it, the conclusion to this saga is that one person was charged, one person was not. Guess who was charged? It was the Trump supporter who was trying to dupe Hillary voters, Douglas Mackey. The other girl was not charged. As far as I'm concerned, she's now scot-free. She's working at some kind of hoity-toity private sector job there. So the two-tier system of justice is obviously real. I've been sounding this alarm for essentially the entirety of my adult life now. I'm not sure exactly what it would take to rebalance the pendulum at this point, but certainly one thing that I've been advocating for a long time is some measure of fighting fire with fire. I think some red state prosecutors have to start kind of hauling in some politically sensitive targets into court, folks like Anthony Fauci. This Hunter Biden indictment is obviously a good place to start there, but I would love to see some red state prosecutors start to haul in some of our own political enemies on charges as well.
Yes, two-tier justice system. So you just highlighted it with Trump, of course, and then even just regular people. I would be on the lookout for it affecting all of us. My last question for you, Josh. Do you think this stuff breaks out of our bubble? And here we are on the First TV talking about this. I have a radio show on SiriusXM Patriot, right? You have your podcast, right? We're talking to ourselves in a lot of ways. How much of this is breaking out of the bubble?
So generally speaking, Mike, when you have a an incumbent president, not every election has an incumbent, obviously. Sometimes there are just two clean slate candidates. But when you have an incumbent president, the campaign typically, historically, has been a referendum on the incumbent. So that militates very well for Trump or, whoever the Republican nominee might be, because Joe Biden's approval ratings are catastrophically low. I mean, he is a horrific president, no matter which way you cut it, from the botched Afghanistan withdrawal to 40-year high inflation to the horrific situation of the southern border. Every which way you look, real wages not keeping up with inflation. Americans are not happy, and they have every reason not to be happy. So based on that alone, I would think that the challenger would be in very good shape. And sure enough, Trump is leading Biden right now in the Real Clear Politics polling average. The major problem for Republicans is that the electoral and voting system still is in place that structurally favors Joe Biden and Democrats. Put another way, none of the actual key swing states that matter, Georgia, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and so forth, have taken measures that I have seen to return those laws to what they were before Democrats opportunistically changed them all during the height of the COVID mania in 2020. So I continue to be a little pessimistic, unfortunately, for that reason there. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that this conversation, I think it's important, but ultimately when voters go to the polls, at least kind of those independent voters, they're really probably voting on the incumbent more than anything else. And that probably does include Trump's legal drama.
Very good. Josh Hammer, The Josh Hammer Show, and Newsweek magazine. Josh, great to talk to you as always, man.
Always a pleasure, Mike.